Hello everyone, Alex here from WarrenOffKeys.com, and in this video I'm going to show you how you can create a more advanced command handler compared to what we have been using throughout the series. So if you have been following along, you'll be familiar with this command.js file, which is a very basic command handler. However, when it comes to more advanced commands, this type of command handler requires us to write a lot of duplicate code, and that's not a very good practice. So in this video, I'm going to show you how you can make a much more user-friendly command handler that'll do a lot more heavy lifting for you, especially in those very complicated commands. So to get started, I'm going to make a new folder here. We'll call this commands. All of our commands will be located inside of here. I'm also going to make a new file called command-base.js. Inside of here, we'll hold most of our logics for actually executing the commands. However, this file will be ignored whenever we're trying to import all of our commands, which we will be doing through this commands folder. We'll also be able to add multiple different subfolders inside of here, such as moderation folders or other things to organize our command files, and all of those files, excluding command base, will be imported and executed as commands automatically. So to get started, I'm going to import my prefix, my command prefix, and this will be something that is from the config.json file. So constant prefix equals require from config.json. I'm then going to export a function, so pass in a client and command options, which I'll show you what those are in a few moments here. So now that we have this, I'm going to make a new file. This will be called add.js. As an example for this video, we're going to be creating an addition command, and so users will be able to pass in two numbers and it'll return the sum. So inside of here, I'm going to export a JSON document. The first thing will be commands, and this can be a string or it can be an array. So you can include your command and then additional aliases such as addition. After that, we're going to add in expected args, and this is going to be a string. So whenever the user specifies the syntax incorrectly for the command, this is going to help us create a correct syntax command. So if we say add 5, but we're expecting add num1, num2, we're then going to complain to the user because they only provided one number. And so the string here of expected args is going to be both of these into one string right here. And typically I like to wrap my arguments in less than and greater than signs. And so you'll see this in action later on. For now, don't worry about it if it doesn't make too much sense to you. Next, we're going to add a permission error. And so this is what's going to happen if a user runs a command, but they don't have access to that command. So in this exact example, we can say you need admin permissions to run this command. Obviously for an add command, that's not necessary, but this is just for an example. Afterwards, we're going to have the minimum number of arguments, which will be 2, and the maximum number of arguments, which will also be 2. So if the user enters 1 argument or 4 arguments or something that isn't just 2, it's then going to complain to the user, telling them the correct number of arguments to use. Afterwards, we're going to create a callback function, and this callback function is going to be ran whenever the command is correctly ran. So callback will have 3 different arguments. The first one is the message object. The second one is the arguments array. And the third one is going to be text, which is all of the arguments inside of its own string. That's not going to be too helpful for this exact use case. However, if you were ever going to create like a ticketing system, so like let's say we have tickets, and then some message here, that could be any number of different arguments because they're inserting just free form text. And so in that case, we would probably want to remove the maximum arguments, and it'll be very useful to have all that in a string, and we will automatically within here. However, with an add, we don't have to worry about that. For now, I'm just going to say to do add the numbers. I'm not going to actually worry about the functionality. Now, there's a couple more things we want to add that aren't going to be too relevant for this, but I just want to let you know that they exist. So we can say required roles, and this will be an array. Let's say we have, there's a math rule that you have to have in order to actually run this command. We can also say permissions, which will be official Discord permissions as an array. So both of these are going to be blank arrays. We don't actually need anything inside of them because obviously we don't really care what type of permissions or roles you have for an add command. However, if you were to create moderational commands such as banning or kicking, you would want to use these. So now we can go back to our command base, and this object here that we just created, this is going to be the command options that is passed in right here. So now we need to import some of that data. I'm actually going to open this to my right over here. I'm going to minimize this so we get more room. I'm going to actually destructure some of this information into our command base and then actually parse through and run the command. So we can say let equals command options. Now inside this object, we can say commands. We can say expected args, and by default, this is going to be an empty string. permission error. By default, this is going to say you do not have permission to run this command. And so these are the defaults where if you exclude this property from this object, or you include an empty string or something like that, we're going to assume that you want a permission error, and so you can change this to whatever you want the default to be. Afterwards, we're going to have the minimum number of arguments, and by default, this is going to be 0. We're going to have the maximum number of arguments. By default, this is going to be null, and I'll explain why in a few minutes once we get to that part. We're then going to have permissions. That'll be an empty array by default, and then required roles, which will also be an empty array by default. Obviously, we have a lot of default things here. That way, if you don't necessarily need a certain feature inside of your options, you don't have to add it. And so it makes it much easier for us as developers to make new commands in the future. Finally, we want our callback, and now we have all the options we want. So we need to now go through these options. We need to check for if the usage is correct and to make sure that it is ready to be used for actually listening for our commands. So how we do that, starting off with the actual commands right here, is I want this to be able to be passed in as an array like this, or as an actual string, such as just add. However, it needs to be converted into an array if it is a string. So we can say, ensure the command and aliases are in an array. So we can say if type of commands is exactly equal to string, we could then say commands equals an array with the only element being commands. And so that'll convert that into an array for us. After that, we need to ensure the permissions are in an array and are all valid. So I'm actually going to go above our exported function here, and I'm going to create a function called validate permissions. This is going to take a permissions object here as a parameter. And I'm actually going to copy and paste in an array here, which is every single valid Discord permission as of recording this video. You can find this in the video description if you want to copy and paste this. Also make sure that this is permissions and not permission. I'm going to copy this, and we now want to loop through this array and make sure that every single element in this array actually exists in this array as well. So we can say for constant permission of permissions. We can then say if not valid permissions dot includes, we'll pass in the permission. We then want to throw a new error, and we'll say with a template literal here, unknown permission node, and then we'll paste it into some strings. So we'll just pass in permission. So now if we insert something that doesn't exist, like let's say test, then it's going to throw an error, and that's going to help us catch some errors when it comes to having typos or something like that inside of our permission nodes. However, if I were to paste in, let's say, manage emojis into the permissions array, it would still work as normal. So scrolling down, now we need to actually use that. And so we also need to make sure that if we pass in a single string here, that it gets converted to an array. So if we only have one specific permission, we can pass in a string, that's fine. But ultimately, it will become an array, and that just makes it more convenient for us. And so we can say if permissions.length, and this will work for it being a string or an array. And so this is essentially just making sure that it exists. So if that does exist, we then want to say if type of permissions is exactly equal to a string. Now, if this is the case, we want to do the same exact thing we did before. So we can say permissions equals an array with the only element being permissions. And then we also want to call validate permissions and pass in this array. And this will call the function we made above and make sure that all the permissions we passed in our options file are actual valid Discord permissions. Now at this point, we want to listen for messages. So we can say client.onMessage. We have a callback, which contains the message. And inside, we want to destructure a couple properties from the message object. So we're going to get access to the member, the content, and the guild from message. We're going to need these throughout some of the functionality here. After that, we want to loop through every single alias and see if we should handle the command. So in this exact case, we're going to loop through the commands array and see if the main command and also additional aliases are actually here. And so we can say for const alias of commands. Now here I want to say if content.to lowercase dot starts with. Here we're going to use a template literal. We're going to add in the prefix. And then directly afterwards, without a space, we're going to add an alias.to lowercase. So if this is the case, a command has been ran. There we go. I need to actually call that correctly. So the reason why I'm using to lowercase is it allows us to capitalize these if we prefer. or if we accidentally do, it's not going to break things. But more importantly, it allows the users to be able to run !add or !add with different capitals, and it's not going to actually break anything. It's not going to expect the user to always use lowercase, because some users might not, whether it's on purpose or accidentally. And so we're going to convert both the message that the user sent and also our own command to lowercase just for the comparison. And so if both of those are the same, then that means that we're now running a command. So before we forget, we actually want to return. We're going to add some code above this, but we want to make sure that we return because there's no need to loop through the rest of the commands because we already know we're supposed to handle this command. So now the first couple of things we want to do is ensure we have the required permissions and required roles. So we can say ensure the user has the required permissions. So we can actually loop through all the permissions. So for constant permission of permissions. Now inside of here, we can say if not member, which we destructured above right here. So if not member.has permission, and we'll pass in the permission string. Now, if this is the case, we want to say message.reply permission error. Now, this is the string that we have right here inside of our options. And so you can change this to whatever you want per command. However, in this exact case, we're just going to say you need admin permissions to run this command. Now, because of that, I'm actually going to scroll all the way up and we see administrator right here. I'm actually going to add that as a required permission. Now, I can do this by adding it inside of the array, or I can just pass in the string. Either way, the reason for that is we just wrote the code to make sure that all the permissions get added into an array if they are a string. Now, with that said, the permission error makes a little bit more sense. And we also want to make sure that we return because we don't want to continue and actually execute the function. Moving forward, we want to ensure the user has the required roles. And so here we're going to loop through the required roles. So for constant required role of required roles. And then we're going to say constant role. We need to gain access to the role. So how I do this is we have to use the guild, which we just structured previously right here. So we could say guild.roles.cache.find. And this is going to give us a callback. And this will be ran for every single role until we return true. And so we're going to gain access to each role while it's looping through them. So if we get a role, we can then return true if role.name is exactly equal to required role. So now we want to make sure that the user has this role, but we also want to make sure that this role actually exists. If either of those are false, then we want to complain to the user. So let's say that I were to add a math role here, but I actually forgot to make that role. That would still complain to the user. This way, it forces the functionality to require that role, and so the owner of the Discord can then go and make that role. So we can say if not role or member.roles.cache.has role.id. We want to say if not role or not this. And so this code right here will say if the role doesn't exist or if the member does not have the role. We then want to say message.reply. We'll pass in a template literal. We'll say you must have the, we'll add in quotes here, pass in the required role. The required role to use this command. Then we can return. Now after this, we know that they have all the permissions they need and they have access to all the roles they need in order to use this command. Next up, we want to split our command into an array based off of different spaces. So if we have the command add 5 and 10, this will become an array with add 5 and 10. The way we can do this, let's add a comment here saying split on any number of spaces. The way we can do this is constant arguments equals content.split. And you might think we can just add a space here. However, if the user adds a bunch of spaces, this is going to add a bunch of empty objects here in our element, in our array, that we don't want. So to fix this and to make sure that no matter how many spaces they add, we can split on a regular expression. To do that, we're going to use 2 forward slashes. Inside, we're going to have 2 square brackets. We're going to have a space. And after the square brackets, we're going to add a plus. So now this will make it so no matter how many spaces there are in the actual command, it'll still always be these 3 elements in the array. Now we don't actually care about the exclamation point add, and so we can remove the command, which is the first index. To do that, we can say arguments.shift, which is a JavaScript function to remove the first element of an array. Now we can ensure we have the correct number of arguments. So here we can say if arguments.length is less than minimum args, which is the number we defined right here, then we want to complain to the user. But we also want to complain to the user if there's too many arguments. In this case, if there are 3 or more numbers passed in. Now, in some cases, you may not care about a maximum number of arguments. Let's say that the user is submitting a ticket using a custom ticketing command, then they might send an entire message that might contain 80 arguments, and so you might not care about that. So that is why we actually have null as a default for max args, because 0 could be technically the maximum number of arguments in something like a ping command or something like that. So we want to make sure that the maximum number of arguments is not exactly equal to null, and arguments.length is greater than max args. If this is true, or if this is true, we're going to complain to the user because they either have too few or too many arguments. So here we can say message.reply. We can add in a template literal, say incorrect syntax, use, and then we're going to add in our prefix. Directly afterwards, we're going to add in the alias. And then after that, we're going to add a space, and we are going to add expected args. And we can return. And so what this is doing is, let's say I ran add 5, 10, 20. This is going to say incorrect syntax. Let's see here, incorrect syntax, use add num1, num2. And this is a string that we see on line 3 of expected args. Now it's important that we're using the alias here. The reason for that is if I were to use the other option, which is the addition command, it would then say use addition. So it's going to match the exact command that they use to not cause confusion. So this is just making sure we have the correct number of arguments. And finally, we can say handle the custom command code. And so we can call our callback, pass in our message, our arguments. And now the last argument here is text, and that's going to be all of them within a single string. And to do that, we can say arguments.join with a space. So if we had an array that said 5 and 10, this would then combine that into a single string with a space in between each element. And so in this exact case, that's not too useful. We'd rather have access to arguments. But in the previous example I gave a few seconds ago of a ticketing system, that'll make a lot more sense to have access to this text right here. Because then you have access to an entire message, which then you can store to a database or whatever you want to do with that. We can now save command base. We should be done with that. We can now save add.js. And now we want to actually import all of the commands within this file right here, within this commands folder. So we can go into our main file, and we need to import 2 different packages for this. These are things that should be included inside of Node.js automatically, so you don't have to install them. We're going to have path. We can require the path module, and then we're going to have fs, so we can require the fs module. Now inside of here, I want to create a variable that'll hold the name of our command base file. So constant base file equals command-base.js. You'll see why we're using this in a few seconds. We then want to import command base. So const command base equals require. We're going to add in a template literal. So we're going to import from the commands folder, and then we're going to insert in the base file name. This is one reason why we have this variable. We're going to use this variable in 2 different places, and that's why we have a variable, so we don't have to write this out multiple times. Now we're going to create a function called read commands. This will take in a directory as an argument, and we're going to call this function passing in the directory or folder name for your commands. Mine is just commands, so that's what I'm going to pass in here. Now inside of here, the goal is to first get all of the files in here, and then we're going to see if there's any folders. And as we come across folders, we're then going to recursively call this function and then try and find all the files inside of those folders. The end result of this will be every single file inside of the commands directory, whether they're inside of a subdirectory or not, will be found and actually read as a command. And so we don't have to import any of these manually. They'll be all automatically added. And so as soon as you make a new command, you don't have to worry about running it. It will automatically be imported and set up correctly without you having to do anything manually. So to get started, we can create a files object. I set this equal to fs, which is one of the packages we imported at the top. .read directory sync. This will synchronously read all of the files inside of a directory. We have to then pass in the directory to use. And so we're going to use path.join. This takes in 2 arguments. The first one is dir name, which is going to be the absolute path. If we look at my console here, we see the C drive, users, Alex, desktop, all this stuff here. That's what the dir name is going to be. So no matter where your bot is ran, that's what it'll use. We then have to pass in the directory that we want to target, and this will combine the two into whatever the result is, and then that'll be passed into the read directory synchronous file, or function rather, and that is going to return all the files within the directory. So in this exact case, it'll return add.js and commandbase.js. Now let's say that I had a new folder in here. Let's call this misc, and inside I wanted to make a very basic ping command. So real quick, I'm going to make a new file called ping.js. I'm going to make one single command called ping. There will not be any expected arguments, no permissions. Minimum arguments will be 2, maximum arguments will be 0. The callback will just simply say message.reply, pong, and we're not going to have permissions or required roles. So now we just created an entire command just by editing a couple configuration things right here. And so this is the advantage to using this command-based system, is we don't have to go through and do a lot of the heavy lifting because it's done automatically for us for every command. Now, obviously, more advanced commands, you will require more things to write in your callback, but that's up to your own individual implementation on that command. So I'm only making this so you see that the ping command, even though it's inside of a subdirectory, is still imported as well. Going back here, we can now loop through all of these files. So constant file of files. And now we want to see if the file that we're looping through at the moment is going to be a directory, because this is going to return misc, add.js, and commandbase.js. And so misc is a directory. Now, in order to get that, we have to get something called stats. So constant stat equals fs.l stat sync. We have to pass in path.join, passing in the directory name, the actual directory, and then the file name. Now we have access to some information. This has a function called isDirectory. So if stat.isDirectory, then we know that this is a directory. And this will be true in the case of whenever we're looping through misc. So now we want to actually call this function again. And so, like I mentioned, this is going to be a recursive function where it keeps calling itself until it finds all of the commands. We can pass in read commands, pass in file.join, dir, and file. And that's all we need to do. It'll then go through and try and find all the files inside of there. Now we need an else statement, and this is going to handle things that are actual files. So in this case, ping.js, add.js, and commandbase.js. However, we want to make sure that we don't actually care about commandbase.js. And this is the reason why we made the base file variable. So else if file is not exactly equal to base file. So now we're only going to care about ping.js and add.js. And here we can actually import the options, or the command options, which will be this JSON object inside. So we can say const option equals require. We can use path.join, pass in the dir name, the directory, and then the file. We could then console log the options to see what we have, but I also want to console log the file name so we know which options is for what. I can then run the bot with node index.js. We see ping.js has this basic JSON object right here, and then scrolling up we see add.js has this, and they have their own individual properties as we expected. So now I can actually call command base, and if we look at the actual implementation of this function, we have to pass in a client and the command options. So I can pass in the client, which I already have access to, and then the options, or option is the name of the variable. And so now we can save this. And inside the command base, I actually want to gain access to the first command here. I want to add a console log saying registering command with quotes. Let's actually make this a template literal. And then inside, I want to pass in commands index 0. Now, if I save this and I restart my bot, okay, so we get an error saying that this is not a function. We need module.exports. So if we save that, we can then restart. We then see registering command add, registering command ping. And if I go into my testing channel, I can try out ping and it replies with pong. The reason for that is our callback right here. However, add won't do anything. And so we can very quickly console log the arguments. And now if I restart this, we are going to see add. It's going to complain, saying, oh, I must have the math role. So I'm actually going to get rid of that because I don't want to actually go through the process of adding that role. So now I can try add, and it's saying that I need num1 and num2. So I can try that, add 5 and 10. And then it says in the console here an array, 5 and 10, and they're as strings. So So we can actually gain access to these. So const num1 equals plus arguments index 0. This is one way in JavaScript to actually convert a string to a number. We could say const num2 equals plus arguments index 1. And then we could say message.reply. With a backtick here, we can say the sum is, and then we're going to pass in num1 plus num2. So if we save this and we restart the bot, we can then actually add those. So add 5 and 10, and it says the sum is 15. Now if I tried add 5 or 4, 8, 9, it'll then say incorrect syntax because we're forcing it to only have 2 arguments. And so we can very quickly and easily set up the basics of the commands. That way, the only thing we have to worry about when actually creating a command is the logic behind the command itself. Everything else is done for us, and we only have to write it once. Now, for very simple commands like this, like ping and add, this doesn't seem like the hugest benefit in the world. But when it comes to commands that require permissions or roles or very detailed syntax, then this is going to save us a bunch of time. Thanks for watching this Discord.js tutorial. If you want to learn more about Discord.js, consider clicking on the playlist you see on your screen now. If you need help, feel free to leave a comment or ask in the Worn Off Keys Discord, which can be found in the video description.